Testing. And we're ready for the party to start here. I'll do the introductions here. Welcome to Nessie, the kaiju that Hammer blocks away, where we'll be discussing Toho and Hammer's unmade 1970s kaiju movie, Nessie, about the world-famous Loch Ness Monster. This is a film that has long been a subject of great interest for many fans on both sides of the Pacific, as well as a source of rampant rumor and unverified speculation. With this panel, we hope to set the record straight and provide what is to date the most thoroughly researched investigation into this film yet conducted. Drawn from Japanese and British sources, we will dive deep into the mysteries of Loch Ness and uncover what monsters may be lurking in its depths. Now, to introduce our panel, we have here Justin Wallace. Justin is a scholar in the field of religious studies who has published essays and taught classes on such topics as the works of H.P. Lovecraft, Ultraman, Jurassic Park, Star Wars, Planet of the Apes, King Kong, and Cryptozoology. And he's a frequent guest on the podcast, The Film Point, where he discusses things all the time. Next up is a very familiar panelist for most of you here. It's author John LeMay. John is the author of several notable books on unmade kaiju, including The Big Book of Japanese Monster Movies, The Lost Films, Terror of the Lost Monster Films, from the files of The Big Book of Japanese Monster Movies, and most recently, Kong unmade The Lost Films of Skull Island. Followed up next, another here, Kevin Jarador, the author of Kaiju Textures, founder of alternative giant monster movies, and runs the Washington podcast, Major Patrol, where he directly reports on Japanese pop culture. Next up is my friend Samuel Eiler, a lifelong fan of kaiju films and Loch Ness Monster. And finally, for myself, Greg Gunn. I'm the host of the ThePmb-Tube podcast, the History and Traveler's Guide, where I usually discuss things of the paleontological and prehistoric, which sometimes cross over into the fields of kaiju cryptozoology. Some of my past interviews with guests in this genre include King Kong artist Joe DeVito, special effects artist Jeff Farley, and also next series author Steve Alton has written a novel about the Loch Ness Monster titled The Loch, which has a sequel coming out later this year called Loch Heaven's Lake. Woo! And now I'll pass off to Justin, who will get us started.
Hi. So as Greg said, my name is Justin Wallace. And like many of my fellow panelists and many of you, I've had a lifelong interest in monsters, specifically kaiju, and also the kind of monsters that are of interest to cryptozoologists. So when Greg first proposed the idea for this panel, it was a really easy thing for me to jump on. So also earlier this year, I published a essay called Crypto Fiction about the history of cryptozoology and science fiction, which, if you want to purchase, was published in a very expensive academic book, or you can go find my Academia EDU page and read it for free. I don't care. I just want people to read it. But anyway, so what I would want to do right now, before we jump into kind of the meat of this panel and start talking about Hammer and Toho's unmade Nessie movie, is that I kind of want to do a version of that paper, but zeroing in specifically on kaiju movies and talking about their intersection with cryptozoology. And also, just because we're at G-Fest, I assume everybody here knows what kaiju is, but I'm going to err on the side of caution and assume that maybe not everybody knows what cryptozoology is. But it's a term that you might have heard, especially because Legendary has started using it in their MonsterVerse stuff. Not directly in any of the movies yet, but the term shows up, for example, Kong Skull Island. They put out these kind of like fact cards for the different creatures that are on Skull Island, and they use the term cryptozoology. And then more recently, the novelization for Godzilla King of the Monsters, they use the term right there on the back. And then also, they might have seen this map that they put out recently that shows where all the titans are in the MonsterVerse. And the three that I have circled are specifically actually cryptozoological creatures. You have the bunyip in Australia, you got the Mokele-Lumumbe in Africa, and then you've got the Loch Ness Monster. So, so what exactly is cryptozoology? Well, so cryptozoology literally means the study of hidden animals. And so I like to think of it as basically the idea of monster hunting. And the kind of monsters that cryptozoologists go and look for are things like Bigfoot or Sasquatch, sea serpents, living dinosaurs, and also like giant thunderbirds. And the two guys that are responsible for this field are Ivan T. Sanderson, who is a Scottish-born naturalist, and Bernard Pulvermans, who is a PhD in zoology. He specialized in mammal teeth. But they are the ones who coined the term cryptozoology, and they're generally seen as the founding fathers of it. And Pulvermans in particular wrote two very important books on the Track of Unknown Animals, which came out in 1955, and In the Wake of Sea Serpents, which came out in '68, that were kind of considered the Bibles of cryptozoology for a long time. And keep those titles in mind because they're going to come up again, including when we start talking about the making of this film. And lastly, I do just want to mention that Sanderson's and Pulverman's considered cryptozoology to be a new branch of biology. There's still an ongoing debate about whether or not it is a legitimate science. I'm not going to get into that here, but I will just throw out there that you cannot get a degree in cryptozoology at any university in the world. So take that for what you will. So Sanderson and Pulverman's work kicks off what's known as like the golden age of cryptozoology in the 1950s, and it runs through the 60s, 70s, and then kind of peters out in the 90s. And this is not coincidentally the same time that giant monster movies are getting started. And so you actually see a lot of cryptozoological tropes in early monster movies. And so, for example, one of them is that somebody gets a fleeting glimpse of a strange, unusual creature. So you see that, for example, like Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The first time they see the monster, it's very brief, almost blink and you miss it. But it was there, right? And of course, nobody believes the guy who saw it, right? He's like, I saw this thing, and they like throw him in a mental hospital, right? So, another important trope is the discovery of circumstantial evidence, like blurry photos, footprints. So you see this in Rodin, for example. They get this incredibly blurry photo of Rodin. They first think it's a UFO. They're not really sure. And then, for example, in the original Godzilla, you have them discover giant, mysterious footprints in the sand on the beach. And that's a trope that's gotten repeated in several subsequent kaiju movies. Another important trope is characters, whether they're explorers, scientists, legend trippers, travel to some remote area to try and find this previously unknown creature and capture it. And I mean, what kaiju movie has that not been done in?
Sorry.
Right? There's so many of those. And then also really important, the final one here that I want to discuss is that the creature is usually identified as a prehistoric survivor, so an animal that was thought to be extinct and turns out to still be alive. And again, that applies to many, many classic kaiju and lots of creatures here today. Now, one of the most familiar cryptozoological creatures is undoubtedly the Yeti, or the abominable snowman. And so I'm actually going to hand things off to John here for a little bit, and he's going to talk to you a bit about the Yeti.
All right, thank you, Justin. In November of 1951, mountaineer Eric Shipton sent a set of photographs to the Illustrated London News showing what appeared to be four-toed human-like tracks he had discovered while attempting to scale Mount Everest. Instantly, the news media links the photos with legends of the Yeti, or abominable snowman, a type of wild man associated with Tibetan religious belief and folklore. The following year, 1952, Bernard Hugh Pullman's is shown casts of the teeth of Gigantopithecus, a nearly 10-foot-tall extinct relative of the orangutan, first discovered in 1935 by anthropologist Ralph von Koenigswald in a Chinese what's that word? Just apothecary shop. Pullman begins to theorize that a relic population of these prehistoric apes could be behind the reports of the Yeti. He's not the only person to have this idea either. Harvard anthropologist Carlton Kuhn and ornithologist Dylan Ripley of the Smithsonian are also thinking about the Yeti and come to the same conclusion, with Kuhn being the first to print this theory in 1954. So once again, we're back to the idea of prehistoric survivors, and knowing this helps to explain why there's a scene in the original Godzilla where Dr. Yamane mentions the footprints of the Yeti when arguing for the idea that Godzilla is a living dinosaur who's at the Japanese diet building. Justin and I kind of share the same theory. So Godzilla was written up by Shigeru Kayama, and Kayama, before he wrote Godzilla, wrote a series of cryptozoological short stories on a Sumatran cryptid called Orang Pendek. And so he wrote The Revenge of Orang Pendek and The Fate of Orang Pendek in 1948. So Justin and I both kind of think maybe Kayama threw in the line about the snowman because he had written those stories. And as another coincidence, after Godzilla, 1955, Toho made the film Half Human, or in Japanese it's called Abominable Snowman, which is about the Yeti. It is a banned film due to its portrayal of the how do you say the word? Barakuman natives. Yeah, thank you. So for that reason, that film's now banned, unfortunately. So Half Human, the American version, was very influential when Warren Coleman watched it as a young boy, And a lot of you who are into cryptozoology probably recognize the name Warren Coleman because he's one of the better known ones, and he also has the International Cryptozoology Museum in Maine. And actually in the new King of the Monsters movie, Thomas Middleditch's character is named Sam Coleman after Warren Coleman. And of course, we also have a slide of these were never meant to represent an actual film. They just had the Godzilla suit on the studio. They had the half-human suit, so they figured, why not take a picture of them, squaring off. But coincidentally, it does kind of foreshadow Godzilla's battles with Yetis, not in movies, but in the Marvel comic book, the Hanna-Barbera animated series, and also Godzilla, the animated series from Fox in 1998. Usually when they would have Godzilla fight the Yeti was just kind of a stand-in for King Kong since they couldn't actually use King Kong. So this was basically the same logic when they produced, or when the Shaw Brothers produced. The Shaw Brothers produced Mighty Peking Man. Some of you might have been here last year, and you might have been lucky enough to see the suit maker, Kizo Murase, actually wear the Peking Man suit and run around. That was pretty cool. Well, the Mighty Peking Man is another good example of a cryptozoology movie, focusing on the Yeti, and it had special effects by Sadamasa Arakawa, who did the effects on Son of Godzilla, Destroy All Monsters. He also had help from Koichi Kawakita of the Heisei Godzilla series. Then there was also the Italian movie Yeti, Giant of the 20th Century, which was another basically based on the 1976 King Kong. And this conflation of King Kong with the Yeti as well as Bigfoot is really quite common, as evident from the 1970 American B movie Bigfoot, which featured the tagline, "The grandest monster movie since King Kong," and in Sweden it was actually released under the title King Kong's Son Bigfoot. But let's put enough time on the Yeti, so let's go ahead and discuss the monster we came here to talk about today, Nessie.
They also reference the Yeti in Peter Jackson's King Kong, but yeah. All right, so Nessie. All right, so world's fastest primer on Nessie for anybody that's not familiar. So the Loch Ness Monster story really begins on August 4th, 1933, when the Inverness Courier, which is the main newspaper in the Loch Ness area, prints a letter from a Londoner named George Spicer, who claims that on July 22nd, him and his wife had been driving along the side of the loch in broad daylight when they saw a creature resembling, quote, a dragon or prehistoric animal, which he said crossed the road, quote, about 50 yards ahead, and appeared to be carrying a small lamb or animal of some kind in its mouth. It seemed to have a long neck, and the body was fairly big with a high humped back, end quote. So Spicer's sighting is important in the history of Nessie research because it's the first time that anybody describes anything that sounds like a dinosaur or a prehistoric marine reptile living in Loch Ness. And Spicer's sighting ends up resulting in a media frenzy, and it generates a lot of attention, including, according to researcher Peter Costello, there were even Tokyo-based newspapers that picked up on it. So I haven't been able to confirm that for myself, but I think Costello is reliable enough there. There were a few more sightings after the Spicer sighting, including a dramatic one on January 5th, 1934, in which a young medical student named Arthur Grant claims he almost ran Nessie over with his motorcycle. And then a few months later in April, Robert K. Wilson takes what is the most famous photo still of the Loch Ness Monster, the surgeon's photo, which is called that because of Wilson's profession. However, despite these developments, interest in the Loch Ness Monster starts to wane and pretty much dissolves with the onset of World War II. People had more important things to think about. It's revived in 1957 by a housewife turned writer named Constance White. She publishes a book called More Than a Legend, The Story of the Loch Ness Monster. And it's this book that really revives interest in the subject and also popularizes the idea that Nessie might be a surviving plesiosaur. And then suddenly, we're off to the races, and you have a bunch of people writing different books about the Loch Ness Monster. Some of the more notable ones, Tim Dinsdale, Doc Holliday writes The Great Orm of Loch Ness. Roy P. Mackle, who was from Chicago, writes The Monster of Loch Ness, and then Peter Costello's book In Search of Lake Monsters.